What's going on, everybody? It's Dan, Moonshine, the Hillbilly Hellraiser. How you doing? I'm doing all right. I can't really complain. Uh, yeah, so I wanted to get into this documentary I just watched recently. It's called, I found it on Tubi, I should say. It's called Nevermore, The Raven Effect. If you're not familiar with who Raven is a pro wrestler. He's been in the business since the mid to late 80s roughly, I want to say, and he's probably been one of the more influential guys in the business as far as uh, with the Raven persona, made famous in Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. Eventually, he went on to WCW and then eventually WWF, and then kind of bounced around from various places. A lot of that they get into in the documentary. But yeah, he had a very he's widely regarded amongst people who are wrestling fans, connoisseurs, or at least students of the wrestling business. He's one of the best talkers in the business. Very intelligent guy. I actually think he's a member of Mensa. Uh, he comes from the school of, as far as like his promos, being on the stick, as some say, but just his ability to talk and to captivate an audience with just his words. It's on par with a guy like Jake Roberts or Kevin Sullivan, even Dusty Rhodes. These are the types of guys. This is the rarefied air that he breathes in as far as his ability to talk people into the building, which is much of what wrestling is. And then after that, you do kind of have to be able to get it done in the ring. I know there's some varied debates on that subject or that concept, and that's been going on for decades. But in my opinion, yeah, you need to talk them into the building. You need to get people, have them have a personal vested interest in whatever it is that you're doing. But at the end of the day, they still have to believe in what you're doing in the ring. Otherwise, it just looks like silly nonsense. It looks like, as some people would say, a bunch of grown men play fighting in their underwear. So, uh, but yeah, he's a phenomenal worker. Again, highly intelligent, which he, throughout the course of this documentary, he tells people many times. Very sound ring psychology, which is something that was on display during his time in ECW with his feuds with Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman in particular, uh, which I'll get into that. But yeah, he's just, as far as the guy, he probably influenced, good, bad, or indifferent, probably an entire generation of wrestlers, if for no other reason, with just the aesthetics of the gimmick that he had. I mean, personally and frankly, I don't see why anyone would debase themselves by going out into a pro wrestling ring wearing jorts and heavy metal t-shirts. It seems like one would want to take their craft a little bit more seriously than that, but to each their own. And for the people who would want to do that sort of thing, they found a home in following Raven. But yeah, it's he had has had so many memorable moments over the years with a variety of wrestlers, but a lot of his fame and notoriety came from probably ECW, and then later on when he moved on from ECW and worked with WCW for a short time, reprising his flock gimmick. Yeah, it was good. So as far as the documentary is about 2 hours long. It might be a little bit too long, I would say. Maybe like 15-20 minutes they could have shaved off, and it would have been good. There's They talk about his early life, his childhood, growing up in a family where, I guess it wasn't the greatest home life. Lots of neglect. No physical or sexual abuse or anything like that, but just lots of neglect, and feeling a little less of his own self-worth as the years went on. Fun fact, apparently his dad was a senior editor at the National Enquirer, if I could spit that out, for a long time. So that was interesting. Didn't know that. Yeah, another fun fact. As they were interviewing people, they mentioned that he's a Marine, which I thought that was wild because if you know Raven or any of his backstory or any of the shenanigans and various hoopla that he's been involved in over the years, I would never have thought that in a million years he's a Marine, but he is. He apparently he took a semester off of college and he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves. So that's pretty cool. You got to give him credit for that. But yeah, they talked to a ton of people. They talked to Sandman and Tommy Dreamer most notably because those were his two biggest rivals in the business. They talked with Blue Meanie, who was one of his flunkies in ECW. They talked with uh, a fraternity brother from college, his wife. They talked with, which I thought was kind of funny. I don't know if it's her legit name or not, but her name's Selena Kyle, and isn't that a Catwoman? Isn't that the Catwoman reference, or that's the Catwoman character or whatever it is, the real name of Catwoman? But anyhow, talked with her. They talked with Chris Jericho. Jericho was pretty good friends with him. They talked with Diamond Dallas Page, who was really good friends with him and got him into WCW during his second run. Um, who else they talked to? A bunch of different guys, a bunch of other various ECW guys and various indie guys because a lot of this was shot and filmed. It looks like in either 2021 or 2022. I say that because they were at a show at the ECW arena that he was a part of, and lots of people were still sitting outside or standing outside wearing those face masks. So I figured that was still the era that they were in while this was being filmed. And also, I think he said in the thing that he was 59, and I believe he's about to turn 62. Is if I'm not mistaken. He's got a birthday coming up in early September, so it was filmed a few years ago. But regardless, uh, but yeah, they talked to a few other people. As far as two notable people that I kind of wish they did talk to, they didn't talk to Paul Heyman because Paul Heyman's under contract to WWE, so he couldn't talk to him. He couldn't do the documentary, or they wouldn't sign off on it. And they didn't talk to Stevie Richards. Stevie was his chief flunky assistant in ECW, and later on he went to WCW with him, and they continued to do the flock gimmick there. Um, but I guess for whatever reason, he didn't want to be in the documentary. He didn't want to be interviewed. I guess they kind of had a really like bad falling out in WCW, and I guess he still feels maybe a little bitterness, anger, hostility, resentment towards the guy. So he didn't do the documentary. But I thought that that probably would have been of a ton of the various people you could have gotten for the thing. With the exception of Sandman, Dreamer, and Heyman, Stevie Richards is probably one of the guys who you really needed to be spoken with. And even, I would say, Diamond Dallas Page, because he knows him so well. And I think he kind of helped rehabilitate him with his DDP yoga. They had Perry Saturnin. They did a few clips with him. Perry was good friends or is good friends with him. They worked together in WCW. They were familiar with one another in ECW. They worked together in the locker room there. I think probably got to know each other even more when they all went to WWF when WCW got bought out. And yeah, just a ton of different people talking about him and how smart he is, how great of a mind for the business that he has. A lot of his personal, I don't want to say hang-ups, but like his personal demons and how he's over the years struggled with those. Ton of funny stories. They go over they did a crucifixion angle in ECW, which was wild. It was one of the funniest things. Not funny if you're a faithful devotee, but funny in the sense that just the whole fallout from it and everything else. It's a fun story to watch. I've heard him talk about it before, and a couple of the other guys talk about it before, where they had Sandman. They put him up on a cross, and Sandman built the cross himself because he did construction. And then all the fallout from the audience and the locker room and all that. It was just it was a wild event in the history of pro wrestling. And I was telling people about this, and they were kind of looking at me flabbergasted. And then I decided, oh, wait, hold on. I know somebody else who did the exact same thing and or tried to, and they're just stunned at the fact that there was more than one person in the pro wrestling industry who thought it was a good idea to do a crucifixion angle. But and I think that's probably, I would say there's probably a solid maybe two or three others that I'm not remembering off the top of my head where they've done that to some degree. But yeah, it was a thing, especially in the 90s, where people, people trying to shock people and all that sort of thing. Chair squeaky. So they start out, they talk about his early life, growing up, Scott Levy, his family. They talk to his sister too, one of his sisters. I don't know if he's got more, but they talk to his sister. Um, and then they kind of intersperse it, talking about his family life and how the neglect in his life shaped the Raven character, kind of inspired it to develop a lot of the brooding, self-loathing aspects of the gimmick that he portrayed. And but then they go into his early years. I actually, when I was a kid, there was a segment on TV, and they talked about a wrestling school called the Monster Factory, and there was this guy on there. Aside from Bam Bam Bigelow, who was one of the big names that came out of there, there was I think King Kong Bundy came out of there. And but on this particular news segment, there was this guy, Scotty the Body, and he was just this loud, brash, obnoxious dude in very loud colors, lots of neon pink and purple and yellows and stuff like that, and fringe, and it was fringe and cringe and all that. But yeah, it turned out to be, it was Raven, and in his early years, and that's how he wrestled, as Scotty the Body. There wasn't a lot of territories when he got into the business anymore, because a lot of that had been gobbled up by Vince McMahon when he took WWF National. So he kind of bounced around from little small territories here and there. Found a home in the Pacific Northwest. They kind of go into that a little bit, and how he learned on the road, and learned how to learn psychology, learn how to become an asset in the business. I think at one point, this wasn't on the documentary, but Perry Saturn's talked about it. I guess he was an assistant for Roddy Piper while he was there, so he was probably, like, carrying his bags and whatnot, and just learning the trade on the job while being with probably arguably one of the best in the business. So that was kind of cool. So then he went to a promotion that I'm really familiar with that they didn't talk about in the documentary, which I thought kind of sucked a little bit. But Global Championship Wrestling. It was a promotion out of Texas. They used to run out of the Sportatorium, which is really cool. And they had the roster on this promotion was amazing. They used to air it on ESPN in the afternoons, and they had you know Scotty the Body. They had Raven was there. JBL Bradshaw, he was there. X Pac Lightning Kid was there. Jerry Lynn was there. Harlem Heat were there as the Ebony Express. Ahmed Johnson was there as Mo Adib. Marcus Bagwell was doing his handsome stranger stripper gimmick there. They had Del Wilkes, the Patriot. He was there. Rip Rogers was there. Just Cactus Jack was there. Mankind, Mick Foley, he was there. Just a ton of guys that were, and it was one of those kind of weird companies where it was well past the Texas wrestling scene had been far the heyday of world class was long gone, but they were still trying to kind of keep the fire stoked a little bit and they were doing stuff at the Sportatorium, and just trying to keep that general vibe. They still had a bunch of guys that were kind of like little holdovers from that era, and guys who had been around the area or the region, but went on to other smaller places like Memphis and stuff like that. But it just never really hit. I think there was some money mark involved and there's some scammy stuff going, but nonetheless. So that was one of the places that he was, and then he wound up in WCW the first time. He wrestled as Scotty Flamingo, and he didn't really make it past the mid card. So he lots of feuds with Brian Pillman, Johnny B. Bad, Marcus Bagwell. Those were a lot of the guys that he worked with. Eventually, he goes and he gets a job with WWF, but they don't see much in him. He goes into detail about that and how he not only didn't get to be a wrestler there, but he ended up being an employee of the company on the production side of things. Uh, but his heart was in wrestling, so he wanted to be a wrestler. So he left the company and he had to reinvent himself, and reinvent himself he did by adopting the Raven character, the Raven persona. And between him and Paul Heyman, they had lightning in a bottle, and that was a lot of the whole ECW thing. Is a lot of it was just lightning in a bottle. Oh, and they talked to Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins because he's a big wrestling guy, owns NWA, very familiar with ECW. I think at one point he almost bought or thought he bought TNA. But yeah, very, very big figure in the pro wrestling industry, if you're all not aware. Yeah, the lead singer of Smashing Pumpkins, is a big wrestling guy. But they just captured lightning in a bottle. It was around that era where, my generation, Gen X, was kind of like that was the youth culture of the time, and a lot of it was like brooding and kind of like sullen and sulking kind of stuff. The grunge music explosion had just happened, so you had all the Nirvana, Pearl Jams, and Soundgardens, all that stuff. And he created this persona where, again, just came out and nothing, no more flashy colors, no more brash, obnoxious, arrogant stuff, excuse me. And he just came out in shorts, heavy metal t-shirts, leather jacket. He fashioned some Doc Martens into wrestling boots by putting soft soles on them. And he just talked about the trauma of his childhood and how it reflected upon his adult life, and he was going to make everybody feel his pain, and that was kind of the catalyst for how the character developed, and they just ran with it. They had Tommy Dreamer, who was he was a guy that they were really trying to get over as a babyface hero character within I hate using the word character, but he was like the hero personality, the good guy, fan favorite. But he was so saccharine and vanilla that in a wrestling territory like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you were just not going to get that over, and they crapped all over it. But then eventually they changed his whole look. He started doing more like hardcore stuff, like weapons matches and stuff like that. But then when he got hooked up with Raven, it just kind of took off from there. They go into a lot of detail about that. I'm not going to go into the whole backstory. They go into talking about Sandman and his feud with him. And like I said, they talk about the crucifixion angle and a bunch of other stuff. They get talking about how he jumped ship to WCW and his time spent there. I actually have a fun story about that. So in the latter days of his time spent in WCW before he left and went back to ECW, he was still doing the Raven gimmick. He had his flock and he had all of his flunkies and everything. At this point, it was him and Chris Canyon were the two. He had linked up with Chris Canyon, and this was kind of like his. I think there was like maybe it was him, Canyon, and Saturn, I want to say, but maybe Stevie Richards was involved. But anyhow, at our wrestling school at Malenko's, my buddy Kevin always used to have this joke because he also did like the heavy metal gimmick for a short period of time, and he would always joke about how it'd be funny to do like a Raven-esque character, but then you find out the big reveal is that he's like this spoiled rich entitled brat kind of person. And wouldn't you know who won the pony? Somehow this winds up on television where he's living in a mansion with a nice pool and fancy poolside service, and the sun is shining and beautiful women all around him. He's got more money than anyone could be able to spend in a lifetime. And kind of like the thing with where I've mentioned it before, like with Jericho and the gauntlets that he used to wear on WCW that I wore when in my first gimmick. We always are kind of left scratching our heads about like, is there cameras in here? Like, what's going on? It seems like every what we think is a good idea that we come up with it winds up on WCW television, but it just is what it is. That's kind of like what wrestling is a very that's the kind of business that it is. There's either lots of parallel thinking or people are just straight up ripping off other people's ideas. It's part of the business. But so they go into his time in WCW and ECW. They get talking a lot about, and then his eventual return to ECW after he had a very difficult time navigating the political landscape in WCW. They talk a lot about his drug abuse problems because he has a ton of drug abuse problems. They talk about him and Sandman. Sandman and him tell a wild story about They tell an overdose story when they were on the road. It involves the two of them and Bill Alfonso, Lil Guido, and Rhino at the wheel, and it's crazy. It's just a crazy story, and with Raven and Hack involved, I expect nothing less. But lots of stories about that. Of course, the subsequent fallout of all those years of abuse to his body between the physical and the substance abuse and how it's kind of taken its toll on him in later years. Go into what he's doing now, and they kind of go over as you'd expect, like, does he have any regrets, the introspection, reflecting on his past and his career, and how does he feel as a person nowadays, kind of being out of the spotlight, because he still gets involved here and there. He's shown up on MLW and TNA, but he's not really a central figure in any major promotion anymore. So they kind of go into that. Is he gonna eventually fall into the wrestler trap of the one more match, or is he content with what he did in his time spent in the business? And it just overall, it's a really cool documentary. I thought it was really good. Raven is one of those guys who he's a pioneer and he's very underrated, very underappreciated. They even go into the whole, well, being in the Hall of Fame, and he says, well, if they do, it's cool, but if not, I'm not worrying about it. I don't. There's certain parameters, like in his mind, he feels like people should have to they should have to exceed before being in any sort of Hall of Fame, which again, from a genius IQ, makes a lot of sense. But it's really kind of sound, very base knowledge. So it makes a lot of sense, his opinion on a Hall of Fame induction of any kind. But yeah, he's just, as far as why I say he's a pioneer and underappreciated and all that, his ring psychology was uh, superb. I mean, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about ring psychology is basically how the magic happens in pro wrestling. It's how pro wrestlers who know how to do it properly. It's one thing to know how to do the moves. It's another thing to know how to put them in the right spots, when and where and how, and it's all intended to elicit the greatest reaction response, emotional response from the fans. That's how psychology is supposed to work. The guys who do it the best they're brilliant at it. Those are the guys who really make the most money. I mean, even something as simple as hulking up. I mean, that's kind of very simplistic ring psychology. Uh, but that's an example of it. Some of the stuff that Dusty would do, even like a facial expression from Ricky Morton when he'd be getting his ass kicked back in the day. He'd have girls crying and people trying to jump over the guardrail to get the dastardly Midnight Express, and just stuff like that. Even you know Jake Roberts and the way he would tell a story or cut a promo on somebody, especially when he was a heel in WWF in his first run, and the way he'd stare into a camera and just kind of hypnotize you, a lot of stuff like that. But one of Raven's best attributes as far as ring psychology is working in a promotion like ECW. It's called Barbed Wire City for a reason. I mean, especially ECW in its early days, there were, you'd have guys there like the Bad Breed, the Rotten Brothers. They'd be carving each other up like Thanksgiving turkeys in Taipei death matches. You'd have all these blood and guts, hardcore matches, weapons matches, all sorts of stuff like that. And Raven, particularly with his feud with Dreamer, he said, well, hold on. not just going to come out here and bleed to death and have none of it make any sense. I'm gonna do like a chicken shit heel gimmick, and these people are gonna hate it, and I'm gonna get heat because I'm not gonna have to go out there and do what all these other guys are doing to try to, the car crash daredevil, just demolition derby style of pro wrestling. He said, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to use old school psychology, and these people are going to hate me. It worked. He did. He had his flock. He had a bunch of his flunkies. First it was Stevie Richards, and Stevie got heat because where Raven had the shorts and the heavy metal t-shirts and leather jacket, and he was kind of cool. The flannel wrapped around his waist. He was cool, especially for the time. Long flowing hair, and Stevie comes out and he's got a long mullet and he's wearing a half shirt and Daisy Duke shorts. And where Raven would wear stuff like Nevermore and The Cult and even like Nirvana or something like that, Stevie's coming out wearing the Bullet Boys and Poison and all that sort of stuff. And it was so. I mean, I really wished he would have done the documentary because he had such a his gimmick was so pivotal. His role in the gimmick was so pivotal to the entire thing working that it's a shame that he didn't get involved. And then Raven gave his flunky Stevie his own flunky, the Blue Meanie, who's this big fat guy, and he's in Daisy Dukes in a half shirt, which is even worse. And he had all these heavies, these enforcers that were with him, and a couple of them would splinter off and they would turn and they'd work with Tommy Dreamer, and this whole ecosystem formed out of this one little feud, and then eventually went on to doing stuff with Sandman, and they did stuff involving his kid, and they get into that in the documentary, involving his kid and his wife, and the psychology behind that. But just a very, very brilliant guy. Knew how to craft pro wrestling that made sense, pro wrestling that would elicit a response, and pro wrestling that was going to get over. So that's the best way to describe why anyone would want to do a documentary on him. Very, very fascinating guy. But yeah, very cool stuff. I highly recommend it. I didn't think I was going to take close to a half hour to describe this, but I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover as far as the documentary goes. So in closing, I would say, yeah, man, go check out The Raven Effect, Nevermore on Tubi. It's there. I'll probably eventually go seek out a physical copy of it because it's something, as far as being a wrestling guy, having that in my collection is definitely worth it. And hopefully they get some special features and stuff like that that would add to the story. But yeah, man, very cool stuff. So anyhow, I'm Dan. This has been Moonshine Talking. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If not, I'm sorry. But if you're new here, go just checking it out because you did whatever sort of search on it. Go check out some of my other videos, see if you like them. If not, again, I apologize. Hopefully you find something that you find more agreeable. But if you like the stuff, maybe subscribe and share it out or give it a thumbs up or all the other stuff that people ask you to do. But if not, again, that's cool too. I'll just sit here and do my videos and see how that goes. But as always, stay sick, stay heavy, stay brutal. Always tuck your chin upon impact. Don't forget to breathe, keep headbanging, iron slanging. Everybody have a good one, take it easy, and I'll catch you on the next video. Later.